Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. First, before we talk on the panel, just want to apologize for the warm weather. I know it's a little hot in here, but I hear that we are working on it, so hopefully it will cool down by the end of the panel today. My name is Lindsay Johnson, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final panel of the 2013 SPARE Symposium. We chose to end the day with three experts who collectively bring decades of experience analyzing, advocating, and collaborating to improve America's legal framework for including and excluding, integrating and prosecuting, welcoming and deporting people who are not born in the United States, but who for one reason or another wish to make it their home. As we've heard today, the immigration system is not just a set of laws. It involves billions of dollars, millions of people, and we are building on a long history that we have to confront whenever we're thinking about making substantive changes. The existence and enforcement of each of these laws reflects the priorities and goals of multiple interest groups. Working for even minor changes requires intense research, communication, and coordination with those who agree and those who disagree about the goals, purposes, and effects of our immigration system on citizens and non-citizens. Each of our panelists will speak to one of the three major areas of immigration law. Edward Alden, sitting on my right, brings extensive experience with immigration enforcement and border security. Tamar, Jacoby, in the middle, works to reform employment-based immigration, and Brittney Nystrom on the end advocates for families who are involved and affected by the immigration system. We are not the only ones who have sought their opinion on these issues. All three of our panelists have testified before Congress, and they are frequently asked to share their thoughts and recommendations on immigration law in publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and they make frequent TV and radio appearances. In fact, just yesterday, Mr. Alden was testifying before Congress. He currently serves as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is an expert on visa and immigration policy, as well as U.S. economic competitiveness and trade policy. He was the project director for the Independent Task Force on U.S. immigration policy in 2009, and he is the author of the book, The Closing of the American Border, Terrorism, Immigration, and Security, since 9/11. Ms. Jacoby is president and CEO of ImmigrationWorksUSA, a national organization advocating for immigration reform that works for all Americans, which links 25 state-based business coalitions. She previously served as a deputy editor at the New York Times, a senior editor at Newsweek, and is the author of numerous articles and books related to immigration and immigration reform. Ms. Nystrom is the director for advocacy at the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which advocates on behalf of refugees, unaccompanied children, immigrants in detention, and provides services through partnerships with over 60 legal and social service organizations. She has also worked for the National Immigration Forum, the Capital Area Immigrant Rights Coalition, and Freed Frank LLP. We will begin by giving each panelist a few minutes to give opening remarks on their specific areas of expertise, and then after a very brief moderated discussion, we're going to open it up for your questions and give them a chance to share about both their experience in the past and especially what is going on right now, as I know they all bring very timely insights into the immigration system and what we can expect for the future. So we're going to start with Mr. Alden.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thanks for all the work in setting this up. There was a lot of organization, and it's all done very well. And I'm delighted to say there's been very little talk about the border today, which is good, because I'm actually kind of tired of talking about the border, even though I will. But one of the things that today has really done for me is it's reminded me why I put so much effort into trying to talk to folks in Congress and the administration, the public, about border security. Because at the end of the day, if there's not some satisfaction on the issue of border security, none of the larger stuff that we've been talking about here today, with all the potentially tremendously positive consequences for millions of people, none of that stuff gets done. So just by way of background, there was a mention, I think, in the opening panel this morning of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. And the issue of border security, everything plays out under the shadow of IRCA. And in fact, IRCA's talked about so much that it's almost become hard to sort of separate the fact from the mythology. The prevailing mythology is that members of Congress, the American public, were promised in 1986 that if we did one legalization, we do a one-time amnesty, we will forevermore solve the problem of illegal immigration, we'll never have to deal with it again. And of course that didn't happen. There was a huge surge in the numbers from somewhere around 3 or 4 million in 1986 to as many as 12 million by the middle of the 2000s. And so the feeling is, well, we were lied to. 86 didn't do what it promised, and fool me once, shame on me. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And that's the whole environment for this debate in Washington right now. The prevailing notion, I mean, we all know that IRCA failed for lots of reasons. As Tamar has talked about eloquently, it didn't provide any provisions for people with employment skills at all levels of the economy to come here. So when our economy boomed in the 90s, there was this big demand for people to come. It failed, as we talked this morning, because there were a lot of folks who didn't qualify for legalization because they hadn't been here early enough. But the big explanation for why it failed was we didn't do enforcement, particularly at the borders. Promise of enforcement, it never happened. And there is a certain truth to this. I believe that there is indeed something corrosive about having laws that are not enforced. If they're bad laws, if they're unjust laws, as we talked about today, get rid of them. And put in their place laws that we actually believe in and we can enforce. And that's not where we've been at with immigration law. So a lot of the debate now is trying to persuade folks on the Hill, particularly the Republican Party, though not exclusively among Republicans, that if we do another big comprehensive immigration reform bill, this is not going to be 1986 all over again. My focus on this has been, with a lot of others, trying to persuade members of Congress that the situation on the border is really different than it was 2 decades ago. So a radically different situation. And we can talk about all the numbers that, in 1990 there were 3,000 Border Patrol agents. Today we have more than 21,000. We built almost 700 miles of fence. We run unmanned aerial drones across the border. The number of apprehensions, which is sort of rough measure of how many people are trying to cross the border illegally, has dropped from over 1.6 million in 2000 to about 350,000 last year. There's a story coming out of the New York Times tomorrow talking about Arizona. And the Border Patrol is actually kind of frustrated with the dialogue now because, as Julie Preston writes in her story, to border officials in Arizona, Congress seems to be behind the times. People in Washington don't really realize how much tougher it is to cross the land border of the United States without papers than it was even 5 years ago, certainly 10, 20 years ago. So that's sort of job one. Job two is to try to persuade people that the law will be enforced in the future. So that even if the situation is better now, there will continue to be an emphasis on border enforcement going forward. And so in the proposal that's been put out by the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate, so-called Gang of Eight proposal, there are discussion of various triggers. That, for instance, that would make the path to full citizenship for undocumented immigrants dependent on a border commission verifying that the southwest border was secure, and dependent on the creation of an effective entry-exit system for tracking visa overstays. So this is the second thing I want to bring up in the open. Job three, which I think is really the most important, and my fellow panelists will talk about here, is to try to link border security to both full legalization for as many undocumented immigrants as possible, path to citizenship, and some sensible, flexible options for people to come and live and work in the United States in the future. And again, the Border Patrol will tell you this. If we had sensible legal options, it would make our job a heck of a lot easier because a lot fewer people would be trying to get into the country legally. And we could sort of assume that if they're trying to do it, they're probably doing it for some nefarious reason, like drug smuggling or something else. We could actually concentrate the resources. David Aguilar, who was the former head of the Border Patrol, former Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, told Julie Preston for her story tomorrow that some kind of sensible legal program would be a tremendous force multiplier for the Border Patrol. So I hope that's where we will get to in this reform package. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll move on to Ms. Jacoby.
Okay, so I'm also going to talk about 1986. So the amazing thing when you go around the Hill to the offices now is there are two things. One is how much momentum there is. It's just a sea change from 6 or 7 years ago. Every office, I want to do something. They're not sure what something is, but they want to do something. The other thing you hear in virtually every office is, let's fix it this time. I don't want to be voting on this now and have to take this hard vote and then have to come back here in 5 years or 10 years and vote on it again and do this again. We can't make this one in a series that started in '86 and this is number 2 and we're going to be doing it again in who knows knows how many years. And I would argue that on the basis of our lesson in 1986, the bitter lesson of 1986 really is that there's only one way to do that. In 1986, we saw reform as a grand bargain. We thought it was going to be legalization in exchange for enforcement. The enforcement we did was not good enough, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But the point is, we told ourselves that we didn't really need the workers. A lot of workers had come illegally in the years running up to 1986. Since we closed down avenues from the Western Hemisphere in the 50s and 60s, we already had 3 million unauthorized people in the country. But the lawmakers told themselves, they didn't ask, like, why are they coming? What's the issue? They said, oh, it's greedy employers. We can wean those, we can enforce the law against those greedy employers, and we can enforce the law against them. We don't need to create a track for workers to come legally. And, you know, I would argue that what they ignored were huge changes in the U.S. workforce and in the dynamism of the U.S. economy. So, you know, already in 1986, these changes were afoot. They're in full bloom now. Americans are having much smaller families. We're way below, or we're certainly below replacement level. Baby boomers are retiring. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day. The people who are coming up behind them, the next generation, your generation and others, are much more educated than the baby boomers were. I always say if there's one set of numbers you need to know to understand immigration today, it's that in 1960, half of all the U.S.-born men in the workforce were high school dropouts. Half. Today, less than 10% of the U.S.-born men in the labor force are high school dropouts. But in a lot of industries, we actually need more less skilled workers. I mean, if you look at the restaurant sector, again, back in the middle of the last decade, 25 cents out of every dollar spent on food was spent in a restaurant. Now 50 cents out of every dollar spent on food is spent in a restaurant. But Americans are getting more and more educated, don't necessarily want to work as busboys and dishwashers. And, you know, the fastest growing occupation in America today is home health aide. You know, how many Americans are raising their kids to be home health aides? And the point is, you know, most of these workers don't compete with Americans. Mostly they complement Americans, is what economists say. They're different than American workers. They're either more skilled or less skilled. And that means that they actually create or support jobs for Americans, right? If you can do an extra shift at your restaurant because you have enough busboys, then that's more work for your waiter and more work for your cook and actually more work for the linen service that washes your linen and more work for the bank that, you know, writes your mortgage. So the point is, you know, less skilled workers, these less skilled workers were already coming in '86. The dynamism of the global economy, of the interaction between our needs and an available labor force in other countries was creating a robust supply and demand. Sure, there were some bad apple employers, but that wasn't the main thing that was driving it. But the law just ignored them and said we can fight that dynamism. You know, we can have the Border Patrol resisting the dynamism of globalization. You know, foolish bet, in my view. And, you know, what's the result? 25 years later is 11 million people living on the wrong side of the law. 99.99999% of the 11 million would rather have come legally. There's no premium about coming illegally. You don't get anything out of it, although the public thinks so. And, you know, I would say 88.888% of the employers who hire them would rather hire legally. Sure, there's some bad apple employers out there. Sure, there's some people whose business model is based on exploiting people. But I would argue that most, you know, 75% actually look at the documents, run the people through the system, pay payroll taxes. I say, you know, the employers I know and work with, if you have a small business and you're putting your family savings in it, you don't want it vulnerable to have your workers taken away. And if you have a big brand, you don't want it vulnerable to being shut down and ruining your brand. So, you know, we can argue about that. But the point is, the policy bottom line is that we need a robust future program for less skilled worker visas. Yes, of course, we also need the PhD scientists and the engineers and what have you, but we need a less skilled program. Employers should have to hire Americans first, of course. There should be clear stipulations and audits and all kinds of things to make sure employers hire Americans first. There should be labor protections, for immigrants and Americans. And the size of the program should vary with the economy. When when in a good year, the economy should grow to meet our labor needs, and in a bad year, the program should shrink so that we don't have extra workers here, although usually extra workers don't come when the economy is bad. But, bottom line, and I'll stop, for most people, they think about immigration reform as legalization, or they think of it as a grand bargain, that same old grand bargain from '86, legalization in exchange for better enforcement. I would say legalization is just a symptom. The need for legalization is a symptom of what's wrong with the system. We need to fix the system, not just addressing that symptom, but fix what's really wrong with the system. And that's the way to do that is by creating a robust, usable, fair worker visa program for the future.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Nystrom, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I'll pick up where Tamar left off, that we absolutely need a system that works. And the three of us have all laid out some ideas of what would get us there. No one wants to be doing this 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I know you mentioned that Congress doesn't want to be doing this. I'm sure we don't want to be having this same conversation 5 years from now again. I won't go back to '86 or '96, but I will go back to the last so-called grand bargain, which was in 2007, which, as you might remember, fell apart. One of the trade-offs was, okay, we kind of admit that in '86 and '96 we didn't do a great job on enforcing the immigration laws. We need to do better. So what has happened since 2007 is the immigration enforcement system has grown as if it were on steroids. We have seen under President Obama over 1.5 million people being deported. That always kind of gets a gasp when I say it, because there's this misperception that under a Democratic president, immigration laws are not being enforced. Quite the contrary. We actually are seeing over 400,000 people being deported each year, and we're seeing over 400,000 people moving through the immigration detention system each year. So in an effort to show that the U.S. can enforce its immigration laws, we've really become imbalanced. You've had all the enforcement that was supposed to show, okay, now we're ready to fix the immigration system, but we haven't fixed the immigration system. So you're stuck with too few legal channels for workers to come through. You're also stuck with too few legal channels for families to use to reunite. Our current family-based immigration system is woefully inadequate and frankly heartbreaking. There are categories of families who are waiting upwards of 20 years for permission to reunite here in the United States. My organization, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, hosted 2 back-to-back briefings this morning, one for Senate staffers and one for House staffers. One of the panelists told the story of how her only surviving relative is her baby brother. She helped deliver him when she was 17 years old. Her mother has died, her father has died, her grandparents have died, their other sibling has died. He's in Jamaica. She's been a U.S. citizen for 20 years. She filed a petition for him several years ago. He's been waiting for 7 years in the backlog of the sibling category for permission to come and join his sister here in the U.S. She has a PhD. She works at the National Institutes of Health. She has shown that she can financially provide for him. He's also college educated. But because our family system is such a mess, there's no way for him to come in playing by the rules. That's just one example of hundreds of thousands, millions of family members who are stuck in this inadequate family-based immigration system right now. And what that means is that family members have to choose, do we want to remain separated, or does someone want to break the law and come in to enable the family to reunite? And many of the 11, 12 million undocumented people that we have today are families. And many of them are undocumented because they made the decision that family ties are more important than playing by the rules of our dysfunctional immigration system. The other point I want to make quickly on detention is that detention in our deportation system also is separating families. So we have the legal immigration system that's separating families overseas essentially, and you have the enforcement system that's separating families by taking a parent and removing them, or taking a child and deporting them. One of the reasons that's happening is that there's not sufficient discretion or due process built into the deportation system. There's very rigid rules on who has to be deported. And unless you can prove that you have really exceptional, unusual circumstances that require you to stay here with your family, oftentimes having immediate family members who are U.S. citizens or green card holders is not enough to convince an immigration judge that the laws allow you to stay here in the United States. Finally, I just want to mention that refugees and asylum seekers are also part of immigrant families. And the last panel focused a lot on the one-year filing deadline. That's just one example of really unhelpful laws in our immigration system that operate to keep families separated. There's obscure problems in the refugee system as well. One is called the derivative of a derivative problem, where if you're a principal applicant, you're allowed to bring your child with you as a refugee, but if that child gets pregnant and is then stuck in that situation of, do I come with my parents or do I leave my baby behind? There's no fix for that. So I just wanted to use those examples to show how completely messed up our immigration system is.
Thank you so much. Before I open it up for questions, because I'm sure you all have a lot of great questions, I'm just going to ask one quick one, and this is for all of you. You know, the one thing that everyone agrees on both sides of the aisle right now is the whole idea that the immigration system is broken. But I'm curious, based on your experience, you know, what metrics should we be using to evaluate the health of our immigration system? Kind of in the past and going forward, what kinds of evidence should we be looking for to say, you know, this is evidence of an improvement, or we need to look at these things to know, you know, where additional changes are needed in the future. So you can just jump in when share some thoughts.
I mean, it's broken in so many places that to sort of pick one metric doesn't quite capture it. Because you could say, you know, I could say, well, the biggest problem is there's no non-seasonal worker program, so the number of people coming across the border to get work is really important. But it's also broken in so many other ways that it's sort of like saying, you know, there's a sick man and I can tell his pulse over here isn't working too well, but, you know, you can also take the pulse in a lot of other places and his fever's too high, and, you know, so I'm not sure there is one that really
Yeah, or if there's a few, you know, if a few
for
things.
me, it's, you know, people coming illegally to work.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say one of the things, you know, my prediction, and I think this was true in 2007, actually, but it didn't get a lot of headlines. I think the hardest thing in doing immigration reform is going to be to decide how to divide up the different pieces of the pie. I think we're starting to see a consensus on legalization and a path to citizenship. I was quite struck because I worked on the CFR task force that you mentioned with Jeb Bush, with Governor Jeb Bush. He was the co-chair of the task force. And he was in favor of a path to citizenship when we did our task force. And he comes out with his new book and says, you know, legalization without citizenship. And his own party kind of disowns it. Says, what are you talking about? Marco Rubio's in favor of citizenship now. So I think on that whole issue, there's been tremendous movement. But some of the things we're talking about here, it's a fundamental problem, right? Which is any immigration system is a quota system. There are always more people who will want to come to rich countries like the United States than we are willing to admit. And if you look at public opinion polls, majority of people actually think we admit too many immigrants already. They think it's either the right number or too many. Only 17% of our latest Gallup poll actually think we admit too few immigrants. And the only easy way to resolve everything we put up here is to admit a lot more immigrants. You know, more for economic reasons, more high skilled, more for family reunification, more refugees and asylees for humanitarian. And the Congress is not going to do that. So the really difficult thing is how you divide up the pie. And we can all tell the horror stories of the long wait,
Right.
But any quota system produces long waits. And I don't think we're going to get rid of that under any sort of reforming. I think that remains the hardest issue. And if there's one thing that will kill this effort, it's going to be that. It's not going to be the legalization citizenship issue. And I hope it doesn't. I hope we
I have an answer to that, but
Sure. So I think one symptom, to use the medical analogy, is the fact that we have 11 million people who are living here in an undocumented manner. I agree completely that given the opportunity to come here in a legal way, almost every single one of those individuals would have done that or would have found a way to adjust their status to documented in the past few years. So if we do find ourselves 5 years from now with 11 million more undocumented immigrants, we probably will be having this same conversation. We have to build an immigration system that is broad enough, that has enough avenues that people can come through the system in a legal way rather than going through the back door. I agree that we do have to decide, okay, when is enough is enough. But the fact that we as a nation have absorbed 12 million undocumented people in addition to however many visas have been allocated shows that we can absorb more people than the current number of visas permits.
So if I can just respond to something that Ted said. On the economic side, actually, the market is pretty responsive, right? So the number coming now of unskilled people coming illegally across the border is something like a fifth of the number that was coming in the middle of the housing boom. Because people here get on the cell phone and say to their cousins and brothers and people from their village, you know, they're not actually hiring anyone in America. It's not worth your making the trip. And people don't want to be unemployed here. They'd much rather be unemployed at home. You know, it's warmer, it's cheaper, you have family. So the market is actually pretty responsive on the worker visa side. It doesn't mean that we don't need it any, you know, politically we'd never get away with no limits, but you know, we're down to about a fifth. When the economy starts to boom again, you're going to see people coming again. Maybe not from Mexico, because Mexico is actually getting to be more of a middle class place, and not so many people are going to want to come from Mexico, but probably from Honduras. But the place that I would be a little pessimistic, I fear that on legalization, I think that what's going to emerge as the kind of Republican center of gravity is going to be a path to legal status, but not a path to citizenship. And that's going to mean, what people mean by that is, you know, allow them to come out of the shadows, be registered, work, travel, what have you, but no, and they're not going to, I don't think even the House is going to bar getting citizenship another way, like you marry or something like that. But I think there's going to be a big resistance among Republicans in the House to creating what they call a special path to citizenship. Now, this sounds like, how could this whole reform rise or fall on the use of the word special? But it might, because I think it's going to be hard for Democrats to say we're okay with legal status without a special path to citizenship. So, you know, I predict, I agree some of these other things are going to be big things, but I think one of the big pitfalls is path to special path to citizenship, or path to legalization with the citizenship option. Hope I'm wrong.
Great, great. So if you have questions, we do have a mic roaming around, but you can start down here. Right here. Thanks.
I guess this question is aimed at Mr. Alden. I'm part of a immigration reform group, and I'm trying to get an idea from you. You were expressing a rather pessimistic view about what could happen in Congress regarding these trade-offs between border control and path to citizenship. Can you give us a suggestion on how advocates around the country could get people in Congress to change this mindset? Because I don't want to get that in the way. I've heard reactions to President Obama's ideas, etc., and it seems to be all hooked around this. Because I think I agree with Ms. Jacoby that in the long run, relaxed immigration, and I'm not talking about illegal entry, is to the benefit of the United States. I look at countries like Germany, Japan, which have also lower than replacement rates of babies. And guess what? They have some big problems coming up in the next 15, 20 years. The United States can avoid that. So we should relax it and embrace immigration. And I'm just looking for an idea from you, put you on the spot, about how advocates might work on their congressional districts to get this mindset changed. Thank you.
I wish I had a magic bullet. I mean, on the border front, I mean, a lot of what folks like me and others in Washington are trying to do is actually get people up to date with the evidence. I mean, for a long time, the whole debate on border security has been kind of very much in the aftermath. Oh, the border is insecure. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that the administration does a very bad job of putting out the evidence it has to try to make its case. But I think there's an education process of trying to explain to members how different the border situation is now from what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And there are lots of different ways to do that. The harder question, I suppose, is whether you want to admit any linkage of border security to these other issues. And this is all kind of a clever optics way of trying to persuade reluctant members that we're not going to do 86 all over again. We won't do a legalization but not do the enforcement. I don't really like some of the current proposals, but I'm not necessarily opposed to some sort of loose linkage if it allows members politically to be able to go back to their constituents and say, the commitment on border security is serious this time. I think advocates have ended up in a difficult position because people see all the injustices in the immigration law, the way it operates, and it's very easy to get into a position where you say, well, enforcement is just bad because look at all the people who are hurt by it. But really where we want to be is that the laws are bad. We need to remake the laws so they work better, but then we need to be serious about enforcement. You know, law without enforcement is not a real law. And so I think it's important for advocates on this to move a little bit from the historical conversation of, well, enforcement is just bad. So, well, no, let's get to a position where we have laws that are good and then enforce those. And I think, again, that can bring around the reluctant members of Congress for whom this rule of law question is a very big one. Yeah.
Great. Ms. Nystrom or Ms. Jacoby, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I guess, you know, I'm sure I'm the Republican on this panel. I'm probably the Republican in the room. Maybe there's one or more, but it's going to be very important for Republican members that they can go home and say, you know, we're not going to have to do it again. And I don't actually think border security is really the way to answer that question, but they think it is. And so the key is going to be coming up with some definitions of border security that we can meet fairly soon. Because if we define it in a way that a standard that we can never meet, like no one coming across or something like that, we'll never get to the trigger will never get pressed, so to speak. The lever will never get pressed, and we'll never get the citizenship. So the smart thing here is going to be, and maybe it's you, who's going to come up with how to define border security that sounds like it means something, but is a meetable standard.
This was I mean, if you want something to put you to sleep at night, this was the Senate Homeland Security theory that I testified on. It was all about this question of metrics having to be
I just would add a very old-fashioned piece of advice. Call your member of Congress. If they get enough calls telling them, I want you to support immigration reform, and immigration reform should fix the laws so that they can be enforced in an effective way, that gives them cover. Most members keep a tally of how many phone calls came in that day, and what were the phone calls, were they for or were they against? And that, in a way, is its own type of cover where you're telling their member of Congress, you won't be voted out of office, at least not by this caller, if you vote this way on this bill. And what's different this time around, this immigration conversation, is who's delivering that message. We have Republicans. We have faith-based community. We have the conservative faith-based community. We have immigration rights advocates. There's a bigger coalition of people demanding immigration reform than we've had in previous attempts.
Great. All right, right here. Yeah, I'd like to. If you want to just hold on for the microphone just so everyone can
tell us who you are,
hear your question.
All of you, if you don't
yeah,
mind.
that would be great.
Yeah, I'd like to continue the enforcement versus comprehensive. It's not versus, but the whole issue of enforcement. And I'd like to ask the panelists, is, in your view, E-Verify part of that, which is the electronic verification system, which is more internal enforcement as opposed to border enforcement? And I'd like to know what your view is on that, because many advocates feel it's a system that doesn't really work, and could give rise to discrimination. And for those who don't know what E-Verify is, it's a system where if somebody comes to you and is a new employee, or even your existing employees, you have to check a huge database to determine whether they're legally able to work. And many of the proposals, including I think the president's, call for, no, but he's voluntary. I'm not sure what the president's proposal is, and that would be another question, that employers have to now use this system before if they hire someone, and if they don't, they're subject to prosecution or fines.
So there's
Do you mind?
There are few sure things in the world, but I would bet my house and my car and my glasses, which are the next most expensive thing I own, that there will be mandatory E-Verify for all U.S. employers in the bill. That is, you know, a sure thing. And I would actually argue, sort of along the line Ted argues, you know, it's not necessarily bad. I mean, that is going to be the best way to stop unauthorized immigration. The border, you know, as then Governor Napolitano used to say, build me a 50-foot fence, I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. The way that we are going to enforce immigration law is by having employers figure out whether the person applying for the job is authorized or not, because that if they can't get a job here illegally, many fewer people are going to come unauthorized. And the question is making a system that works and making a system that, you know, I think one of the key things, obviously you want it to not be cumbersome for citizens, you want it to not be discriminatory, and you also want it to be that, you know, if an employer actually goes into the system and gets back a yes from the government that says you can hire that person, the government is then not going to come the next day and say, by the way, you're under, you know, we're fining you because you hired somebody that we told you could hire, and they're also not going to be open to lawsuits from Americans who got wrongly turned away. So, you know, E-Verify is coming. The big questions are, can we make it non-discriminatory? Can we make it as accurate as possible? Can we make it so that it works for businesses? And they're trying. It's now accurate. It's pretty accurate for U.S. citizens. It's not at all accurate for unauthorized immigrants, because it catches the ones that have fake Social Security numbers. If I just buy a Social Security number that's totally made up, it will catch me, but if I borrow Brittney's, it will not catch me. So there's a long way to go on it actually being effective, but I guarantee you it will be part of the package.
I would just add to that, to answer one of your questions. Yes, it was in the leaked version of the president's bill. It's also part of the Senate's bipartisan principles. I agree, it's coming. Another open question, though, is when. Will it be an immediate requirement? Will it be a kind of rolling requirement? And that's a big question, because if you're a rural dairy farmer in Idaho, and 2 months from now, you're supposed to have access to a computer database for all of your potential workers to be run through, that's a lot more challenging, because currently there's not a legal workforce who wants to milk cows in Idaho. So we need to create a workforce first and then layer on a way to verify that workforce.
Okay. Other questions? Here, sorry, just wait for the mic. And if you don't mind just giving a brief introduction before you ask your question.
Thanks. I'm Jennifer. I work in City Council here for a Latino representative. And in the opening panel, there was an observation, you know, that we need this to not be a one and done, you know, reform, and we need to look at the ongoing presence of undocumented folks in the United States. And there was a pretty nuanced discussion of some of the legal reforms that might help the system deal with that better. And I'm just wondering, for the folks sort of in DC at this level, what's the appetite? Where does this fit in the discussion, given specifically the amount of money flowing through the deportation system right now, the amount of private profit involved? Is that part of the conversation? Can it be? Will it be part of the conversation?
So just make sure I understand. Is part of the conversation the profit to be made?
No, like I believe in observing that we need to deal better and sort of have better systems for ongoing immigration. To me, that is in tension with the amount of money flowing through ongoing deportations. And my fear and assumption is that we will not deal with those reforms as part of this, that it will be one and done because there is money to be made off of a continuing large-scale deportation system after we do this legalization. Does that make sense?
I think so. So Another given, and I don't have my glasses on, so I won't miss it, is that there will always be a pretty hefty enforcement system. There will always be a large number of people being detained and a large number of people being deported. I would love to see an immigration system that did that with more justice, more fairness, more due process. And that is a reform that can and should be part of this package. I share your assumption that we will need to keep revisiting the immigration system. The fact that we have revisited it in 86 and 96 and now here we are again shows that it's not an easy system to build. Things change, technologies improve. There will need to be some kind of ongoing monitoring. And it's interesting to think about who are the influencers on this debate. Certainly one of them is the private prison industry. They stand to lose a significant amount of profit if suddenly there are no customers to fill the immigration detention beds. And there have been research and studies and articles written about the influence of the private prison industry. I'm sure there are many other influencers who stand to gain from perpetuating a broken immigration system, but that's the one that comes to mind.
Any other thoughts on the panel? Or okay, go to the next question. Go right up here.
For me, as undocumented immigrant Mexican, I don't think, or I see the immigration reform is coming for so long. Because while the America Latin is in the poorest, corruption, narcotraffic, we are looking for some help. And I don't know what is the rule of all of the nations of America Latin working in the immigration reform.
The role of Latin
American nations.
Mainly Mexico, because Mexico is the most people here in USA.
I was talking about this with some friends of mine, my colleague Shannon O'Neill, who's just written a book on Mexico, Andrew Seeley from the Wilson Center, who's another fine Mexican expert. I said, what is the Mexican government doing this time? And they said nothing. They said the Mexican government is hiding. And there's a reason for that. There was a big effort right when George W. Bush became president to negotiate a migration accord with President Vicente Fox, which ended up dying after 9/11, caused a lot of controversy. You know, why are we negotiating with Mexico over our migration rules? You may remember in the 2006-2007 debate over immigration reform, there were the big marches in Los Angeles where some of the young people were waving Mexican flags, which backfired terribly. There is a real nationalistic element on our side, and a lot of us may have on the Mexican side for that matter, which is these are our laws. Mexico shouldn't have a say in this, and they should stay out of it. And that's largely what the Mexican government has done. Now, there are a lot of quiet government-to-government conversations on improving cooperation in the border environment, on trying to make the ports of entry work better. I think there's the prospect in the future for actually much closer government-to-government cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico in managing migration, perhaps with some of these low-skilled programs. So I think there is a role, but I think in terms of the political debate, I think the Mexican government is going to stay out of this because I think they're worried that it could backfire politically.
Yeah, but I agree with that, but I would not say nothing. I think they understand in a sophisticated way that they're not supposed to be doing it publicly, that will backfire in the political debate. Americans want to do this because they think it's in America's interest. They don't want to do it because they think they're doing a favor for Mexico. But certainly the consulates and are active, are working, and there's been a big effort, I think a very important effort that needs to be recognized in the past more than 5 years on the Mexico side to try to do what they can to make border security as real as possible and to make border cooperation as real as possible so that Americans aren't so frightened of reform and of a border that works.
Can I just maybe just add a little bit to that? People don't know about what attorneys general have done because it's been more of a state issue. In 2004, the Attorney General of Arizona and I and a couple other attorneys general held a border conference and invited attorneys general from Mexican states to come up. And we started then working on collaboration, memorandums of understanding, which we've signed now individually between not just border states, but interior states like Utah with Mexican states. Part of that is not only sharing information, but also helping them with their developing judicial system where they're moving from more of a written advocacy to oral advocacy. So we have now, meaning Western attorneys general primarily, have cross-trained in trial advocacy over 5,000 Mexican police officers and prosecutors who come 100 at a time to our different states, and sometimes we go down there and teach in the Mexican states. So we're developing this law enforcement working relationship with them that now the federal government's taking a look at, and we're trying to expand and grow that out and growing out to El Salvador and some other states to try and to spread that working relationship. And I'll just say this, that in Presidente Calderon, when he first came up here right near the beginning of his administration, he said, look, we want to help. We'll help secure our side of the border, but come on. We have 40,000 dead Mexicans because of your drug habit, number one, and guns that are flowing south. And can't you do something to keep those guns, that are outgunning our law enforcement and military? And not long after that, Fast and Furious, debacle came up, and nothing really has been done, and the laws haven't been passed or the resources necessary to do that. So I do think there's an appetite, and state by state, for example, Nuevo León, there in Monterrey, they have a program there that's for testing and documenting workers, and there's a long line of them, and they just want to try and work state to state. We got very close to forging an MOU between Nuevo León and the state of Utah to bring documented workers up. But then with the most recent election, that's kind of fallen apart too. So there are those there who want to help, and I think there are ways to do it state to state and show, but we do really need to understand that they're dying down there because of a drug problem and because of guns, and we haven't solved that problem for them yet.
Thanks, Mr. Sherliff. Just kind of building off of that, how do you see immigration reform changing or amending kind of state and local government roles? I know that's a conversation we've had previously in the day, but I'd be curious how each of you sees that kind of fitting into the larger picture.
No, I'm not sure I've got a great answer to that. I mean, a lot of this, we're in a law school, a lot of this has been fought out in the courts in the case over Arizona, and I think, again, the Attorney General might actually be able to speak better to this because he's been in the middle of a lot of these battles. I don't see anything directly on the table in the legislation that talks a lot about state roles going forward. I suspect things will settle down into some sort of reasonably cooperative relationship where state governments are not directly enforcing immigration laws, but there needs to be cooperation between local police and federal immigration authorities in identifying people for deportation. That seems to have begun to settle in with secure communities. I suspect that will continue going forward. I don't see any radical change in the state.
Yeah, I think there'll be less states trying to pass their own laws, but I think there will be continued, I think Republicans will want continued cooperation from state and local law enforcement with federal practice, and I think that could emerge in the House as one of the big asks, actually, from House Republicans, and more SCOMs, more what have you. And the other big role of states, right, is on the good side, right? I mean, enforcement's not the bad side, but on the good side, integration. That's like there's never going to be enough federal money or assistance or help or whatever for integration. There's never going to be enough state money or assistance or help for integration either. A lot of it's going to have to be the private sector. But there's a big role for states to play in that regard. And, some of the states, Illinois, whatever other states, are already showing the way on that. And I think, once we kind of get over, if you think about the immigration problem sort of writ large, it should be the easy piece should be how do we decide how many we let in and sort of create avenues for them. The hard piece is like how do we make sure that we're for all, even as glorious as our differences are, we actually hold together as one country, and people can succeed here, have the skills to succeed here. So, states can play a big role in some of that stuff, and, I hope they will come up to fill that void.
Yeah. I agree that federal action on immigration reform will alleviate a lot of the pressure that you see from states like Arizona, where they are trying to show that they're doing something on immigration because the federal government has absconded by not doing anything. Tamar made me think of another interesting point where the states can get involved, though, are issues like health care. I would be shocked if comprehensive immigration reform includes health care for individuals who are transitioning from an undocumented to a documented status. It's a shame. But the way the Affordable Care Act is written, undocumented immigrants are out. It will be incredibly expensive if we decide to extend coverage to 11 million new people, even though they're paying into the Social Security and the Medicare system. So states will have a role to play in things like who provides health care, who provides education. To become a citizen, you have to pass an English test. Who's going to be providing that English language instruction? States, for the most part. So I do think we'll see a shift in how states are engaging in the immigration issue, but they will continue to engage.
Some states will do it well and some states will do it poorly, and that'll be a big...
Okay. I want to move to the back to make sure I'm not ignoring any. Are there any additional questions? I thought I saw a few hands. Oh, right behind you. Okay.
Hi, thank you. I'm Mary Meg McCarthy from the National Immigrant Justice Center. The Private Prison Corporation question made me think about who are the influencers right now in looking at more due process in the system, ensuring that the rule of law that is so fundamental that we don't have people arbitrarily detained, that we have access to the courts, that there's really a system that's consistent with what we all expect as Americans, aspiring Americans, in a justice system, in the immigration system.
I wish there were more influencers. Right now, it's groups like the American Bar Association, the panel previously, immigration lawyers who can attest to the power of having representation. There aren't enough of those voices, honestly. Attorneys general can be helpful. Even law enforcement officials who can say everyone benefits when we have a fair system. But that particular point on due process and rights as people are going through the immigration system has not gotten enough attention in the current conversation.
Now, sometimes the private sector starts understanding the winds of willing. One of the big private prison companies is now going much more into alternatives to detention. Has hired the former ICE boss, Julie Myers, to be their lobbyist. I'm trying to expand alternatives to detention because they realize, the current model of the comprehensive immigration reform, the numbers in detention are going to go down quite substantially. So sometimes, the market kind of begins to understand where things are going, and so you may actually get powerful private sector groups lobbying for reform because they see it as in their business.
Okay.
My name is Art Reed. I'm General Counsel of Friends of Farm Workers in Philadelphia. And I'm going to direct my question to Tamar. I deal with many of your constituent members. But I'd like you to address from your members and interest perspective the difference between employment programs being for long-term permanent residency versus continuation of temporary worker programs, and also, since you said you sort of asterisked out the seasonal programs, what you see as being the demands that your clients will make on the current seasonal program.
Yeah, good questions. Those aren't hard questions. So for a long time, the programs that we have, just for those who are not as current as we are about the programs that we do have two small, I would argue, bureaucratic, cumbersome, not very user-friendly, seasonal temporary worker programs. And the basic structure, the model for how they work, is that an employer tries to find Americans, and if they can't, they ask the government for permission to hire a foreign worker, and they basically sponsor the foreign worker coming to the U.S., and that foreign worker works for them for the whole season he's here, and the employer pays for his transit, and in some cases he pays for his housing, and he's responsible for him. We actually think in the non-seasonal sector that that's a very bad model. And the unions call it indentured servitude, and we're not going to use that language. Somebody said yesterday at a hearing, practically slavery. We're not going to use that language, but we don't think it's good for the workers or good for the employers. So we think it would be much better if when the employer tries to hire an American and finds he can't, and tries, and you got to make certain things he has to try, that what he gets is not a particular person, but a slot. He gets the right to hire a foreign worker for the next 2 years. And he'll match up with an employer with an employee rather, so that employee can come into the country, but that once that employee gets there, if he doesn't like the employer, the job doesn't turn out to be what he likes, or it turns out the conditions are not what he likes, or the whole thing's been lied to or whatever, he can quit that day, day one, hour one, and go to work for another employer who's also proved he has a need. And the point of this would obviously be good for workers because, the ultimate bargaining right, it's like voting is your ultimate civil right. The ultimate labor right is you can quit and tell the employer, where to put it, basically. But it's also good for employers because we want a situation that's more like a market. And, we think that a situation where if you don't have so much work available at that time, you're not responsible for keeping the worker on. Which is true now in the H-2A and H-2B programs. And we also think that, let's say for some awful reason I love that worker who I sponsored, but it turns out that, his grandmother died and he has to go back to Mexico for the funeral. I don't want to have to start over with the Department of Labor and have another 6 months of proving that I need someone before I can hire someone. So we think a more fluid, market-like situation with full portability, is the labor term of art, is a good idea. And we think that's a permanent residence. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, permanent residence. Well, there too. We think.
I'm saying, just to be clear, are you prepared to say that all of the persons who come into immigration should have the right to have a path to citizenship? Because frankly, then you solve your problem with the undocumented workforce. It's the same path.
Yeah. No, we think that my reading, and this is not even me speaking as an employer, right, or employer representative. When I look at the way most people function, the way the market works, the way the flow works, a lot of people come for a short time and actually then want to go home. And they want to make some money and they want to send the money back and build a house and they only want, it's a young man's game, and when they want to get married, they want to go back. And we think that there are going to be a lot of people like that who actually want to come on a short-term visa, and that's fine. And for those people, I'm getting there, let me get there. I think there are, however, some people who actually do want to stay in America. And they tend to be the ones who are successful here. And you see them, I've spent time in sending villages, and you see the people who come back are the ones who didn't like it that much, and the ones who stay in America are the ones who succeeded. In the sending village I spent time in, they went to New York and they eventually bought the coffee shops where they started out as the busboys. Those kind of people we should have an ability, as with H-1B, there's dual intent. There should be the possibility of switching from a short-term visa to a permanent track at the end. So what employers are proposing is a dual intent short-term provisional visa where a lot of people will be short-term, but then at the end of your short-term stay, if you like it here and you've done well here and put down roots, you can petition to stay and get to a permanent slot. Not for everyone, but we wanted to see what the demand is.
What would be the labor standards of the phrase? In other words, would you agree that employers should indeed pay market wages for each of those jobs? Would you agree that employers should indeed pay market wages for those jobs instead of, as your clients are now arguing, pay substandard wages for those same jobs?
So
you guys are getting a little taste of difficult negotiations.
Yeah, this is why this is hard.
And I'm not negotiating, so I don't have to worry about getting
I don't
along.
have clients, right? Like, I actually find employers willing to speak out, and I work with them. I don't actually have clients. But so just to, I don't have clients. But I think people would be willing to pay market wages. I think we probably have a different definition of what market wages are.
Okay, Mr. Alden and Ms. Nystrom, do you have any thoughts to add about temporary programs or guest worker programs, feasibility, or any experience working with those?
I actually think this gave the
We've
whole
covered
audience a pretty good lay of the land.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah.
Or maybe not. I don't know.
Okay.
But he's had his hand up. So just to continue this little discussion,
All right. We may have to start.
You've offered two different sort of justifications, and Ivan Daniel spoke earlier. Two different justifications for a worker visa program. One was that if people had an alternative to coming unlawfully, they would come lawfully. A second justification is that there are just not enough workers right now. To follow up an Art's question, neither of those two justifications speak to why it should be at all temporary. These are not temporary jobs that people are coming here to do. or would be coming here to do. People would be coming here to set up roots, establish roots, to really become part of our society. People always have the right and the option of leaving the United States. We don't lock people in here. I had a green card. My family came here as immigrants. My parents went back to Chile. So nothing speaks to the temporariness and what the justifications that you're talking about. And then the other justification that you've given, Tamar, is the economic one. For the high school dropouts, the unemployment rate for older high school dropouts over 25 years old is 50%. And that has been years old, and it's not just since the recession. For younger high school dropouts, the unemployment rates are double what the general unemployment rate is. We as a country have a problem about providing opportunities, career opportunities for Black youth, for Latinos, all of the workers who actually are competing with the workers that come in with temporary worker programs. So the issue is really, I don't know what your reflection on that is, or what you think are a national responsibility to workforce development and actually not increasing the pool of exploitable workers or workers who are unemployed. And by the way, just so it was the Southern Poverty Law Center's Close to Slavery report, and Mary Bauer was the one who testified at the hearing.
It was. I think the country should be doing workforce development and helping prepare all Americans to take jobs. And I think we'd be in a better situation if we had a legal program where employers had to try to hire Americans first. That's the point. We want to get away from a situation where there's no regulation on these employers, where they do have to try to hire Americans. But if they go through a rigorous process and try to hire Americans and people don't show up for the jobs, and I'm not going to talk about why some high school dropout over 50% doesn't want to go to work at McDonald's, or go to work as your home health care aide, but there might be reasons. And when there isn't somebody who shows up, then I think the employer should be able to hire a foreign worker. I think it should be harder to hire a foreign worker than an American. There should be incentives built into the system so that it's easier to hire an American. But if you can't find one and you're making a choice between, do I close my business, or do I not grow my business, or do I break the law, I think there should be a streamlined and reasonable way to hire a foreign worker.
Okay.
I mean, I would just add, with respect to the board, I don't think there's any way analytically to say that a temporary program would be better than a permanent program, or vice versa, in terms of taking the pressure off the illegal path. I think the issue is whether there are legal alternatives. I don't think you can say that temporary is right.
But I think you could say the contrary. The temporary programs, in fact, result in large numbers of people crossing the border legally through temporary programs. Historically, across
I think the history is misunderstood, and a colleague of mine has gone deeply into the period of the 1950s, and I'm going to say something will be controversial here, because the Bracero program was in a lot of ways a horrible program. I'm not arguing that the Bracero program had great merits. The working conditions were terrible, a lot of reasons for its elimination. But if you look at the data, which is the number of people trying to enter across that border in the 1950s measured by apprehension data, what we saw in the early 1950s was a big increase up through 1954. Then you had the Eisenhower administration increase the Bracero quota, doubled it to more than 400,000, and launched a really nasty enforcement program that has gone on in history called Operation Wetback. Numbers of people trying to cross illegally plummeted. The apprehensions went from 1 million in 1954 to 88,000 the next year. They stayed at that low level through 1964 and the elimination of the Bracero program. So I think the argument that temporary worker programs cause illegal migration is, at least in the case of the U.S. historical experience, factually wrong.
And if we could print all the green cards we wanted, I would have no trouble with giving people permanent visas. But we can't print all the green cards we want. It's a very scarce supply. And I think again, my experience in Ascending Village, almost no one came to America thinking they were going to stay permanently. 99.999% came to America thinking they were going to work for a little while and go back. And a few of them, you know, some numbers stayed beyond 5 years, and then a smaller number stayed beyond 10 years, and a handful that had come from this village over 25 years ended up staying permanently. So, and you know, and we should have a path for them. If we could print green cards, I'd say, you know, plaster the room with them. But guess what? We can't.
Okay. Sharon will take your question.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to ask this in a way that's not misunderstood, because I have a bad habit of being misunderstood. First of all, I support what you're talking about, and I'm speaking directly to Ms. Jacoby. But we're talking about priorities for immigration reform, and I think one of them has to be political support, public support, things of that nature. And a big problem with that is people don't have the same understandings of things. And now I come from a different place than most people in this room. I'm from Texas. I'm from a blue-collar family and community. Almost everybody in my family has been self-employed. I own my own business in the construction trade. And the people that put together the statistics that you were quoting during your opening speech are highly educated, Northeastern politicians, economists, lawyers. And you say that immigrants are not competing for our jobs, and you're talking about a very specific subset of jobs. In the construction industry in Texas, most of it is done through subcontract, and it's not employers and employees. It's a different relationship. And I have seen subcontractors who are American-born white people lose their companies because Mexican immigrants, whether legal or illegal, work a whole lot cheaper. And there are no minimum wages for a subcontract position. You quote a price, and if you are willing to work 80 hours a week for a few dollars an hour because your ultimate goal is to get back to a place with a lower cost of living, you're taking not a job like an hourly job, but you're taking work and money away from people who want to live in an American lifestyle and work 40 hours a week and provide for their families. And so I think we all need to discuss these things in a way that people in those other communities can understand the global impact, or whatever, the nationwide impact of what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely fair enough. I mean, that should not, that's not legit. I agree with that. People shouldn't be, certainly the independent contractors should be required to pay their workers a reasonable way, a legitimate, accepted wage.
I'm talking about some of the immigrants are the contractors themselves. They're not working for somebody else.
But I mean, there should be requirements about what wages people pay. There are requirements about wages people pay. I assume if they get rated or audited or something, they have to pay a prevailing wage. I mean, the point is, my point is, let's bring this underground market into the light of day and into the realm of legal scrutiny. And it's very hard to do that when it's, 11 million people in an underground market, or 8 million people, or actually the number of the 11 million supposedly working. When it's 8 million people in an underground market, it's very hard to regulate it. If most people are in a legit market, then the bad guys are the outliers, and it's a lot easier to go after them. And there should be regulation of that kind of an operation. But it'll work a lot better if you get most of it into the realm of legitimacy. And that's what we're arguing for. The employers I work with say, I don't want to be, I'm willing to pay what it costs to get in the realm of legitimacy. Let's get the system in the realm of legitimacy as opposed to under the table.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing that we try, whenever we discuss these issues, we silo them off. We're talking about immigration, and so we talk about immigration. The fact is there have been a lot of forces that have worked against the interests of mid-paid working people in the United States for the last 40 years. I think international trade has been one of those forces. I think immigration has been one of those forces. I think technological change has been one of those forces. The tax system has been one of those forces. You can come up with a lot of reasons why American incomes have been stagnant for 40 years. And so, we're dealing with a lot of issues that overlap in a whole bunch of ways. And, at the end of the day, I agree with Tamar. We're better to bring these people in the sunlight, make it possible for the AFL to go out and organize them, try to create better worker rights for people so they don't undercut the wages of American workers. But there's a lot of stuff going on that leads to the results that you're describing. It's not very hard to press on the
So these conversations definitely highlight the tension and the difficulty that we're facing in immigration reform. But I'd like to kind of close it out by giving each of you a chance to kind of make some predictions. I know, I know that you're very involved with this, but I'd kind of like just to kind of hear, you know, from being on the ground, what kind of you've seen, and then also kind of on an optimistic note, what things would be your priorities that you think may be reasonable and may be on the table. So if you want to jump in, or Ms. Nystrom, if you want to go ahead and start.
Sure. So my prediction comes from the front page of the Washington Post today. So I cannot claim it, but it's a rumor that has been circulating for months that in this immigration reform debate, the number of family-based visas will be reduced. And the reason that mostly Republicans are pushing this is that they feel that the balance between employment-based immigration and family-based immigration has tipped too much into the family category, and they are trying to balance it back so that mostly high-tech visas are boosted. I disagree with that assumption that it's a fixed set of employment and a fixed set of family-based visas, and you have to decide where to draw the line. This should not be a zero-sum game. We can print more green cards. We can make more visas available. And in this immigration reform opportunity, to pretend that you have to rob visas from the family-based immigration system and give them to the employment-based immigration system is a fallacy. So I predict that the whole notion of who gets visas and based on what skills and based on what relationships is going to be a very dynamic conversation. I hope that it does not end with the family-based immigration system being ransacked. That would be not only a moral outrage, but it would also just serve to increase illegal immigration going forward, because as I said earlier, family ties are so strong that they will not be deterred by an immigration law.
So there's a Republican congressman who's very much in favor of reform and been working hard for reform for a while, and I won't name him, but here's how he predicts, and then I'll bracket it a little bit. It's sort of entertainment value, but he's been working really hard behind the scenes for many years, and he says, you know, the odds are better now than I've ever seen them. You know, the president sees it as his legacy, Republicans see it as their political future, labor and business are united. You know, ag is unified, you know, high tech is for it, and then he pauses for effect and he says, I'd put the odds at about 5%. And, you know, I think I go a little better than that. You know, I think I'm sort of 50-50 most days. Some days, especially when I have to meet with my union counterparts, my sense of the odds go down. You know, I think a lot is going to come down to these two things that well, you know, let's add the family versus employment, but I think I would add the two things I think it's really going to come down to is I think Republicans are going to come over to the, you know, what feels like a big stretch for them, which is legal status, and then the big question is going to be, can D's meet them there, and if not, what happens? And, you know, do Democrats then say, oh, you racist Republicans, you can't meet what Latinos need, and then do Republicans say, or do Democrats even say, well, wait a minute, you know, Mr. President Obama, your preference for the perfect over the good is what's stopping people from coming out of the shadows at all. And I think, you know, that's going to be the debate, the big you know, question mark, I expect. I think there's also a big question mark about the business-labor negotiation.
I guess my big hope in the process, it sounds like a strange one. I'm actually slightly more worried about the Democrats than I am about the Republicans. I think the Republicans are going to come around on this. They got creamed in the November election. They see their political future going out the window with a growing Latino American population that could go the way of the African American population for Republicans. I mean, it could become a firmly Democratic voting bloc forever. And immigration, I think a lot of leading Republicans now see as a big problem for them. They want to get it off the table so they can talk about other things, particularly the Latino voter. I worry a little bit on the other side because there's a big wish list on the Democratic side that people have been fighting this for years and years and years and years. And my worry is at the end of the day, the Democrats won't take yes for an answer. Because they'll say, we want the perfect thing. We've been fighting for this for so long. The balance of power is finally in our favor. We want a whole enchilada, as the Mexican foreign minister once put it. I hope that the Democrats will know how to say yes on this. And I think it can be.
Great. Well, thank you so much for those insights. If you'll join me in thanking our panel. And before I let you go, I would be remiss if I don't take just 1 second to thank all the people that really worked hard to make this day possible. First, in the Toll Public Interest Center, we have to give a huge round of applause to Arlene, Joanna, Nicole, and Emily, who really put it all together. Also, we want to thank Dominic and the rest of IT for getting all the little details together. Joe Campbell and the facilities team, and Jordy Sabate and the communications. So just a round of applause. And the last thing I have to say is I hope that you'll stick around and join us upstairs for a reception. Thank you so much for coming today. It's been great to have you. All right, no, thank you so much. Are you?